Hi. Welcome to Academics Anonymous. My name is Paul. I have been in school since 1943. My father led me by the hand down the endless hall of Berryville School into Miss Jones' kindergarten class. It was just 1 week after my 5th birthday. I was hooked. I never wanted to leave. I have been in the classroom every fall since then, except for 1 year when my family moved with me to Seattle in search of release from this addiction. We failed. That was 23 years ago. I thought I might be free when they tore down Berryville School 11 years ago and replaced it with condos. It didn't work. So I am taking the only course left to me. I'm retiring. I have another clear recollection from a year before I entered kindergarten. That's right, it's supposed to be blank. The U.S. was at war, in the last good war. There was a scrap drive in my hometown, one of many during World War II, during which citizens were urged to contribute metal to the war effort. On that particular designated morning, I took my only significant physical object that I owned, a heavy iron truck, and I put it on the basket in front of the neighbor's house. It was hauled away, presumably melted down, and I am sure became part of the tank which several years later drove through the German defenses at the Normandy invasion and launched the Allies on a war on the road to winning the war in Europe. I told that story to my mother about 5 or 6 years ago. That's a long time ago. And she said, I always wondered what happened to that truck. I felt so bad when it disappeared because you just loved playing with it. Who would have thought that that little kid, putting his favorite truck on the scrap pile in Kenosha, Wisconsin, to help the war effort in 1942, would 25 years later be marching down the streets of Memphis, Tennessee, protesting against a U.S. war in Southeast Asia? And what would that little kid think if he found out the sacrifices demand of U.S. citizens by the president some 60 years later when he had declared war on terrorism? Now, in order to contribute to the war effort and help make the U.S. strong, I should go out and purchase a new pickup truck. Or better yet, an SUV with lots of expensive features. Go to the mall and buy a new sport coat, eat dinner at Applebee's, take a vacation trip whose expenses would mount up as I bought airline tickets, hotel accommodations, auto rentals, and lots of souvenirs. Have our values changed? As World War II developed, we were urged to be frugal, save, recycle, and the war wasn't even on our soil. Now the U.S. has been directly damaged and we are urged to spend, even if it means borrowing credit cards, you know, to do so. Perhaps this is another indication of the sad state of affairs John Friedman bemoans in a 1998 article about the new political economy of planning. He says that in the past 4 decades of planning, we've come from the credo of the benevolent state, upon which planning was founded, to the present welter of a triumphant market economy driven by global competition. The market economy, says Friedman, doesn't solve urban problems, it creates them. Its vision for the future, he says, is pathetically narrow, and it comes down to the one syllable: more is better than less. Growth is mandatory. Consumption is a civic obligation. But in fact, of course, The materialism of the consumer society has very little to do with the good life, which is rather about the quality of human relationships. When I was a sophomore in college, I realized that I wanted to be a college professor. More especially, I wanted to be a history professor. John Stipp, the coolest history professor in the history of history professors, was my mentor, and I wanted to be like him. I don't think so, Mr. Miller. What a put down. One of my motivations, though, was a desire to be around young people, because I never wanted to grow old. I think I was intuitively aware of this defining characteristic of being a teacher. What I didn't anticipate adequately was the dimension of this cruel graph. There is something inexorable that as you don't die, you just get a lot older than the people you're dealing with all of the time. And they can no longer remember the stuff that was so important to you. When I started, they couldn't remember Franklin Roosevelt. Now, they can't remember Ronald Reagan. Now, historians are all about context. So are planners, which is one reason I found the shift from one to the other so congenial. It means I cannot deal with ideas without setting context. Sorry, I just can't do it. 40 years is a significant clump of time. I began my career as a full-time university professor, as a historian, in 1962. John F. Kennedy was president of the United States, and a month after my first classes started, the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, when Kennedy publicly challenged the Soviet Union for setting up missile bases in Cuba. And the U.S. threw a naval blockade around the island. It seemed that the United States and the USSR were on the brink of the big war. The grocery stores were packed, and you couldn't buy bread and water when the announcement came. But Khrushchev blinked, his bluff was called, and we didn't have a nuclear war. But you know that. That year, the New York Mets began their first season losing 120 games. New York Yankees won their 20th World Series. And the Green Bay Packers won their second consecutive NFL championship, 16-7 over the New York Giants, with Bart Starr as quarterback. And how come that's not shifting? Oh, because I'm hitting the wrong button, that's why. That really is Bart Starr, you know. He's a good friend of mine. Okay. The University of Cincinnati Bearcats beat Ohio State for the NC2A championship that year. I remember watching that game on a black and white TV at a party at a friend's house. Liz and I didn't own a TV at the time. Being technologically challenged is nothing new for me. By an amazing coincidence, the leading scorer in that game for UC was Ron Bonham of Muncie Central, currently Delaware County Supervisor and Director of Prairie Creek Reservoir. I had never heard of Muncie or Ball State Teachers College, much less Prairie Creek Reservoir, but I had heard of Ron Bonham back in 1962. I started out as an instructor of history at Penn State University, teaching through an innovative medium, closed circuit television. I had been married less than 2 months to a recent graduate of Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, my girlfriend 3 years earlier when she had been a freshman, and whom I had seen 5 or 6 times since then. We had alternately written letters and kind of, there was no email then, and long-distance telephoning was really out of the question. It was too expensive and would scare the daylights out of wherever you called because you could only afford to do it late at night, and they probably thought their grandmother had died. So don't do that. And we'd alternately kind of stopped writing letters to each other too for a while. So when we were married, we were relative strangers, but we did do that anyway. We piled into a '56 Ford that I had just bought with my last dollars, really. And we traveled to take up residence in Happy Valley, State College, Pennsylvania. When I came to Ball State University, to the history department, it was May 30th, 1970. During the previous 8 years, John Kennedy had been murdered in Dallas, Texas. Martin Luther King Jr. had been murdered in Memphis, Tennessee. And Bobby Kennedy had been murdered in Los Angeles, California. Urban upheavals had broken out in nearly every city in the United States, especially notably in Watts' section of Los Angeles, in Detroit, Newark in 1967, and Washington, D.C. in 1968. The U.S. waged an undeclared war in Vietnam, and many people, including me, protested in the streets. It was not a comfortable time to be around. Richard M. Nixon was president. On April 30th, he had announced an invasion. He called it an incursion of Cambodia, widening the war in Southeast Asia and an announced effort to destroy Viet Cong sanctuaries. That led to predictable demonstrations across the country, including one on May 4th. Remember, I said I came here on May the 30th of that year, but perhaps you don't remember that. One on May 4th at Kent State University, during which 4 students were killed by bullets fired by Ohio National Guard troops. It was something to be worried about. This is a young assistant professor sitting in the window of his office in Dallas Hall at Southern Methodist University the day after Kent State to witness the demonstration at Southern Methodist University, which, being SMU, was very refined and restrained. Patton won the Academy Award for Best Picture that year, and George C. Scott, in the role of General George Patton, won the award for Best Actor. His iconic opening speech in that memorable movie began with a truly memorable statement. "No bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won by getting the other poor, dumb bastard to die for his country." Enough of war. The Environmental Protection Agency was formed in 1970, also headed by Hoosier William Ruckelshaus. The National Air Quality Control Act was signed into law by President Nixon. It called for a 75% reduction in pollution from auto exhausts within 5 years. The North Tower of the World Trade Center was topped out, making it the tallest building in the world. When I joined the College of Architecture and Planning as one of 2.5 faculty in the Department of Urban Planning, it was 1982. Ronald Reagan was president. In foreign affairs, the freeze in U.S.-USSR relations continued as the Soviet Union stepped up its war in Afghanistan. Israeli forces advanced into Lebanon as their response to Palestinian attacks on Israel. The sudden and mysterious deaths of 7 people in the Chicago area were traced to Tylenol, capsules that had been laced with cyanide, leading to a nationwide alert and the recall of all Tylenol, this resulted in the seals and safeguards and fingernail breaking devices that are found in all sorts of bottles and containers today. I don't think anyone was ever found who perpetrated those deeds. And even though Ronald Reagan was president, no one was deported as a result of this frightening act of terrorism. The nation was in an 18-month recession. AT&T was broken up. Ma Bell, the telephone company, divesting itself of its 22 Bell telephone operating companies. Telecommunications would never be the same again. That was both good and bad. I spent the academic year 1982-83 once again as a student at Rutgers University, going to classes and obtaining a Master of Science in Urban Planning. The provost got my report card. Pressure. And it wasn't my good friend Warren Vanderhill either. I wasn't always a planner. I came to it late through being a historian with particular interest in late 19th and early 20th century U.S. history, then urban history, then black history, and eventually urban studies. I taught all those courses at Ball State in the 1970s. I must say that from 1970, 1973 or 4 or 5, I don't think I've ever had a better time as an academician, or maybe never had a better time as a human being, as I did here. It was an awe-inspiring thing, having moved here from Dallas, Texas to Muncie, Indiana. Why are you moving there? To find a true community of scholars. I had the great good fortune to be a young punk at the time who was assigned to an office on one of the outbuildings on South Talley, a crummy little old structure where there were a bunch of other young Turks like myself. John Barber, Tony Edmonds, Warren Vanderhill, Dave Cammons. Wow. We had more fun, better times, more arguments, more discussions, more disagreements, more parties. It was wonderful. And teaching courses like Black History and being, as you can see, not an African American, what a trip that was. It was absolutely exhilarating. Making the switch to urban studies and then to planning was in one sense easy. Both history and planning, as I've said already, are about context. And they're both synthesizing professions and ways of thinking that require you to know everything. You have to know everything to be a good historian. You have to know everything to be a good planner. I'm not sure I'm qualified. But in another sense, it was very difficult because it marked the shift from my original academic culture and home. When I joined the Department of Urban Planning in 1982, it was very small. It had begun with 2 faculty in the early 1970s, and they both left. It restarted with a new chair, Dave Johnson, who hired 3 additional faculty. After about 6 years, most of them had taken jobs elsewhere too, except for stalwart Francis Parker. It was a graduate program only, offering a Master of Urban and Regional Planning. So, there was Francis Parker, myself, and part of Dave Shane. There were some close collaborators, particularly Tony Costello, who had helped keep things going in that area. And I brought with me the Urban and Regional Studies program, an interdisciplinary major housed in the College of Sciences and Humanities, which between 1968 and 1986 had graduated over 260 majors. There was a new dean, Bob Fisher. He charged us with starting up an undergraduate program. 5 years, just like all the other majors, undergraduate majors in the college, and starting with a common first year for all students who would then declare their majors at the end of their second semester. What emerged from that charge was a new 5-year Bachelor of Urban Planning and Development degree, the only one of its kind in the United States. As part of the ongoing process of change and adjustment, as most of you know, this now is a 4-year degree program, but it's still called a Bachelor of Urban Planning and Development. We worked on the curriculum together at what is now Vera May's, a fine restaurant on Walnut Street, which was at that time the Muncie Urban Design Studio. I don't think you'd use the word fine in connection with the condition of the building at the time. Hari and Michelle and Scott Truex and Tony Costello can attest to the hours of work they put in just simply making that a habitable place. But it was a fun place to be and think. Francis Parker, Tony Costello, and myself together assembled the curriculum for this undergraduate program in kind of charrette fashion, pinning together 3x5 note cards of different colors on the partitions in that place. In putting the program together, there were some guiding principles that we had. We wanted to have, and these principles were kind of intuitive, I think, have become articulate as the program has developed. Graduates would have skills, knowledge, and values needed as the foundation for careers, as professional planners. The emphasis would be on general comprehensive education, not on narrow specializations. Let individuals develop those as their own careers progressed. Interdisciplinary, of course. After 8 years directing the Urban and Regional Studies program, which had no department and depended on faculty from everywhere else, I wanted to retain the best of that program that had started so many URS students out into public careers that included planning, Chamber of Commerce work, social service agencies, and other sorts of related careers. So we kept courses in economics, geography, political science, sociology, and natural resources as part of the core requirements. Another feature of this was that it was studio-based, to draw on the strengths of the College of Architecture and Planning, which offered a studio-based education built on the premise that reiteration and close relationships with faculty were the best model of learning. And hands-on education. Our studios would always deal with real situations because we can't possibly make up anything that's as interesting as real communities, and it would take too long anyway. Whenever possible, we would involve real people as well, whether in a semi-client status or cooperative venture. Here's a bit of a gear shift. I want to talk a little bit about rootedness and place. In his book, The Lexus and the Olive Tree, New York Times foreign correspondent Tom Friedman writes about two powerful forces pulling us all in opposite directions. His book is really an effort to define globalism and to describe how it works as well as how it affects lots of people. In it, Friedman uses the Lexus, the Japanese luxury car built with excruciatingly precise robots, as a metaphor for the fundamental age-old human drive for sustenance, improvement, prosperity, and modernization as it is played out in today's modern globalization system. This system, for Friedman, represents all the burgeoning global markets, financial institutions, and computer technologies with which we pursue higher living standards worldwide today. Globalization, he says, is an unrelenting force, pushing forward and dominating every place where the drive to improve one's standard of living is operative. He depicts a world in which what he calls the electronic horde moves with frightening rapidity to invest or withdraw capital, to transform economies and societies in this rapid world of highly accessible technology, information, and financing. In contrast, he posits the olive tree as a metaphor for everything that roots us, anchors us, identifies us, and locates us in this world. Olive trees, says Friedman, give us warmth of family, the joy of individuality, the intimacy of personal rituals, the depth of private relationships, and the confidence and security to reach and encounter others. One wonders if that rootedness is tied to place. In this college, we talk a lot about a sense of place, and we devote considerable energy and talent in teaching about and learning to design and facilitate the creation and preservation of places. The planners among us see community as being place-bound. When we go to communities, the very stuff of our work, we visit individual places. And yet, the world we live in increasingly seems to be shrinking and even merging. Within our college and our university, there has been an increasing effort to internationalize the curriculum and the palette of interactions in which our faculty and students engage. Also, our own lives are less likely than ever to be lived in one place, in one community. I offer my own experience as an example. I was born and raised in Kenosha, Wisconsin, between Chicago and Milwaukee. Furthermore, another defining characteristic of me, which Warren already alluded to, this is the building where I was born. You may not recognize it, but it is a church. I was born in that little thing sticking up on the right-hand side of your screen, which was my parents' bedroom. My father was a Pentecostal minister. Part of his pay was the flat up on the third floor. It was a scary place to go to when you were 3, to get through the dark downstairs and up a steep stairway to that garret. So I am a preacher's kid, and I think that has been one of my defining characteristics all my life. I'm very different. I do not follow the same religious start that I had, but I can't escape. That's part of me. I went to college in Galesburg, Illinois. Spent 4 years there, met several hundred people from other places. Some of them even came from other countries. Then I moved to Denver, where I lived for 3 years while I was in graduate school and met still more people from other parts of the country and the world. When I finished graduate school, I married a woman from Birmingham, Michigan, whom I had met in college. We came from very different backgrounds, and I dare say we sort of didn't know that much about each other, to tell the truth. But we then moved immediately to State College, Pennsylvania, where we lived for 3 years. Following that, we moved to Memphis, Tennessee, where we lived for 2 years and where our first child was born. Have you ever seen a father more terrified of a baby in your life? Just home from the hospital. From there, we moved to Dallas, in Texas, where we lived for 3 years, into the first home we owned, a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, sliding glass door to patio, living room, den, wood-burning fireplace, fenced-in yard, with a mother and a father and 1.6 children, as you can see. Our second child was born there. That's the one on my back. Then we moved to Muncie, Indiana, where we lived for the next 32 years, and hopefully for a good many more, if we're lucky. Here's where our third child was born. Incidentally, after the birth of our third child in Muncie, our by now 4-year-old middle daughter figured out where babies came from. Every time you moved, you had a baby. It turned out that she was right. We stopped moving, and we stopped having babies. Think about it. After a number of years here, we moved to Seattle, Washington, where we lived for 1 year with the entire family while I was on sabbatical, as you now know, the only year in which I did not attend class, and where I had the good fortune to work for a city councilman on the hottest issues in Seattle. Urban reinvestment, gentrification, affordable housing. That's where I discovered those things, which have been significant parts of my life since then. Several years later, I went on special leave to New Brunswick, New Jersey, where I went to class at Rutgers and got a degree. Now, more than that, in addition to that, ever since 1968, when Liz's parents built a house up in this part of Michigan, we have spent a total of close to 2 years of our lives in Arcadia, Michigan, on the shores of Lake Michigan. That's where I've lived. Long enough to say that's where I live, not just as a visitor. So, in which of these places am I rooted? Or am I rootless? Or, because I have a sense of belonging in several of them, not all, am I multi-rooted? Is that possible? Do we have to water the roots? Or are roots cultural and portable? Especially when we stay within the basic culture, the United States, and various other things that go on to describe me. Is my rootedness dependent upon my being in a particular place? Well, the values I imbibed from my parents and my peculiar upbringing, my ethical and value roots, don't depend on where I live or even on what kind of people I am surrounded by. All people have worth. And I knew all sorts of people growing up. All work is honorable. And if you're clearing tables, be the best table clearer in the place. Money has its place, but you should never do anything just for money. Material goods have no ability to satisfy. When my mother gets her check, she's now 92 years old. Do you know what she does with it? She gives most of it away. The universe was not created just for you. So you need to be committed to something that's bigger than you are, son. You can never give too much, and never put your elbows on the table when you're eating. And I might add, never leave any food on your plate. Well, I still believe all of that. And I don't live in Kenosha, Wisconsin anymore. Well, let's think about the question of proximity and community. Is community maybe something else? That is a challenge, I think, that faces all of us, is for us to define our communities. So here you see the familiar 2x2 table here. It's got 4 cells in it, right? And that means 2 of them have got both qualities, or one of them has both qualities, and the other one has neither quality, and the other 2 are mixed. So if you look at this, you can see, all right, you can have, on the one side is proximity, yes or no, community, yes or no, community and proximity, okay? That's the good one up there, right? You're there, you're in place, and you have community. My church parish in Muncie, okay? I'll identify that as a primary community that shares proximity. But I also have community without proximity. Our 3 daughters. Where do they live? Baltimore, Chicago, Madrid. Are we a community? Yep. Proximity, no community. Well, what about the neighbors? I have to admit, we have some neighbors like this. Okay? And then there's no proximity, no community. Like Bears fans who live anywhere. Okay? I couldn't care less about these people. All right. Now, how does that relate to a scholarly work, to our scholarly lives? Well, I think the Department of Urban Planning faculty, that's a community. One might almost say it's a family. We punch each other in the face once in a while, we holler and yell at one another, but down deep inside, we really are a community, and we have the same thing in mind. We're very much enthused about planning. We're very much enthused about our students. We want to help our students do as well as they possibly can. So there's community and maybe sometimes a little too much proximity. Well, what about planning educators nationwide? We share a lot of the same values, but we don't see each other. Maybe once a year, maybe once in a while. We communicate in other ways. We read each other's stuff. We find out what's going on. So you can have community without proximity as well. As place becomes less important in terms of our employment, that is, you have somebody like one of our nephews, he's a commercial artist, a graphic artist. Where can he live to ply his trade? Anywhere. He happens to be living in New Jersey, but that's not necessary. As it becomes less important, perhaps the quality of place becomes even more important. That's what a lot of communities are beginning to discover, and why there is so much concern about quality of life. A little word about planning as it has changed. Planning started from the premise that there is a discernible public interest, and that this public interest is justification for community planning. According to this premise, planners should stand above the infighting of politics, rising above the backstage dealings of the vested corporate interests that usually prevail, to articulate, defend, and uphold this public interest. By this idea, planners would discover and give voice to the broad interests of people in a long-term perspective, which hopefully would be embodied in something like a master development or general plan. But it seems to me this confidence that there is a common public interest and that planners can discover and articulate it has faded during the past 4 decades. In its place is a kaleidoscope of public interests which change with particular issues or among particular interest groups. Some historical activities that I've described and that I've witnessed in my lifetime have contributed to this, it seems to me. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s and going forward, urban renewal and our reaction to it, the war in Southeast Asia. Both in the rice paddies of Southeast Asia and in our urban centers, actions led to the discovery, in the words of the immortal Pogo, we have met the enemy and it is us. Remember that graph? Where are you on that graph? Some of you relate to Pogo and the rest of you Po-ho what? Is that a drink? Is that sort of like mellow yellow or what? Okay. Pogo was the philosopher who I read the most when I was in college. Check it out. We have met the enemy and he is us. Vietnam became the first postmodern war. There were blurred distinctions between enemy and friend, blurred objectives, which got reduced a lot of times to almost pure body counts. Who's killed the most today? More and more materiel pounded the jungles. We got less and less assurance that we were achieving a military objective, much less a political one. We experienced the paralysis of a giant power. Whoops. Let's stick with this one. Urban renewal. The public interest turned out to be fairly narrowly defined, probably misguided. And as in Vietnam, we destroyed the city in order to save it so often. Just a quick depiction of urban renewal in one city, Hartford, Connecticut. Little friendly business on the corner. There's the bird's eye view. You can see that little business down in the corner. Ha! There it is. Right there. Trouble with these lights, I've always observed, is that they don't stand still. That's the urban renewal solution. Pretty drastic. And that's the final solution. Also, pretty drastic. There was a lot of disillusionment that came with urban renewal because it also meant that if you look at these two pictures, you can see a lot of people and businesses and things are not there that used to be there. And so some people paid a very high cost, while other people seemingly got a very high benefit from it. Okay. Civil rights. Certainly in the 1950s and on into the 60s, the image new to Northern whites, of which I am one, that the oppressor, the ones beating young women or young people and children for marching, were agents of the public. They were police officers, state troopers, and by their direction, mayors and governors, whaling the tar out of folks and given the power to oppress by the voters. The pictures of hatred, screaming and yelling at a young person who wanted to go to school were pictures of regular people like you and me. Folks got killed because they were working for the right to vote. Often by the people who were holding the public offices that they wished to vote for. So the government ceased being the well-meaning entity, vigorously intervening on behalf of justice, truth, and beauty, and assumed to have a far-sighted and comprehensive vision of the public good. In fact, in postmodern society, according to a lot of people of that persuasion, the state becomes the enemy. Another thing that globalization brings that calls into question this notion of a definable single public interest is the increasing migration that is happening throughout the world. Migration has always happened. As soon as trade happens, you find people moving all over the place and moving from one spot to another. Leonie Sandercock writes that postmodern cities and regions have become the locus of extraordinary cultural diversity. As you see here, I guess I'm just reading this to you, becomes so intense that the notion becomes increasingly exhausted. It is not easy for so many ethnic groups with diverse culture and social practices to live together. So then, negotiating these social spaces, making them safe, imprinting new identities on them, is one of the central socio-political and socio-cultural and political dynamics of cities and regions. And planners have a pivotal role to play in them. We are witnessing a worldwide clash between the secular and the sacred, write others, in which the secular is tempted to commodify the sacred, while the sacred is tempted to destroy the secular lest it contaminate further. That's what's going on in so much of the world today. Modernism rejected the centrality of the sacred, deemed it unproductive. How do you deal with these sacred kinds of values? It reminds me of a story of a friend of mine who was in the Illinois National Guard in the 1960s. You know, those weekend warriors. He was assigned with his outfit to be the Aboriginal people in this mythical location. Instead of amicably settling things with the invading troops and spending the rest of the day sleeping under a tree somewhere, he decided to play the role of the tribal chief to the hilt. He threw the entire maneuver off. The troops came in and he said, "Get out of our burial grounds. How do you expect to talk to us if you're going to stand in our burial ground?" And what? It was so bad that eventually the brigadier general in charge of the maneuvers was called in to deal with him, and he said, "Get that Jeep off our grave." The guy had to follow through. I'm not sure why my friend wasn't either court-martialed or shot. The point here is that they had no idea what to do with a chief who valued the burial grounds more than their Jeep. It never occurred to them. And so their little war ground to a halt. Well, this kind of cultural clash adds another dimension to the universal answer of planners to any questions, which is 1, 2, 3. You guys aren't going to graduate. It depends. Of course, the answer to that is on what? And that's a very good question in its own right, and we're not going to get into that except to say that, you know, this clash occurs between us all of the time. Sometimes it even occurs within each of us. A friend of mine sought my advice about what to do with a piece of land long held by her family and now in the path of development. Her dilemma: should she sell the land to be developed into a sensitive kind of assisted living facility, or should she keep it in its undeveloped natural state? Wouldn't the former be just commodifying sacred space, which held so many memories? Or could it be justified by the socially valuable use to which it could be put? Ultimately, each of these decisions becomes a matter of our own values. And sometimes those are issues we wrestle with internally ourselves, and others they're issues we wrestle with collectively, with groups of people. And we've all participated in those kind of things where you have people sitting around the table and everyone is correct, and they're profoundly disagreeing because they're coming from different places. Their sets of values that are being applied in this situation are very different. That is a classic planning kind of an issue. It gets a little more complicated as it is not just our interests, that is, how our pocketbooks are affected, that are at stake, but our very core values that are at stake. And it seems to me that's what is leading to so much of the utter violence that we see throughout the world today. Well, a little bit about choices. Oops, I missed this one. Choices. That's the one I wanted. Sorry. Got lost for a minute there. There are a wide range of choices. According to Friedman's view, again, we're going back to Tom Friedman now and his issues about globalization, the explosive democratization of information, finance, and technology has led to the tyranny of the electronic horde. But there are still wide ranges of choices for those plugged into this globalized system. But the only choices for society are the choice of to be plugged in and participate with the electronic horde or be rendered obsolete and passé. We're faced with enormous personal decisions. I just pulled this one out of Time magazine, a recent issue, I think it is in January, where they talk about choices that are overwhelming us in the United States today. Society is handing us more and more responsibility. The internet gives us more and more information. We are expected now to make choices about things about which we know virtually nothing. We just give ourselves a 2-hour cram course on the internet and become instant investment, legal, or you have it, experts. The consequence of bad choices in some of these can be pretty serious. Time singles out 3 things. One of them is health care. What plan do you choose for health care? Oh. Oh, I don't know. It depends on what? Well, I don't know. Okay. Another one is the choice of retirement plans. And many of these are incompatible. So how do you communicate? Liz and I avoid that. We don't have any of those things. But here we are betrayed by our own telephones, which are plugged into the wall. We don't even have mobile phones that you can walk around in. If you walk around and talk on the phone in our house, it'll fall out of your hand because it's attached to the wall, and we still can't figure it out. Okay. Well, what do choices mean for planners? Well, this is a part of our ethical statement, and you can read this. It's on the internet. Go to the APA site and find out about it. But that planning process participants should strive to expand choice and opportunity for all persons, recognizing a special responsibility to plan for the needs of disadvantageous. Oh no, a misspelling in one of my slides. Quick, get that one off. Okay. We should try to widen choices for people. And I'm just going to cut that part short. Now I want to just talk about a few things that people have asked me, what are you going to do? Well, I'm not going to tell you everything I'm going to do. I don't even know everything I'm going to do. But I want to tell you what I think are things that grow kind of organically out of the fact that I'm a planner, I'm a preacher's kid, that I've moved around a lot of places, and that I take my profession very seriously, as well as my role as somebody for whom the world was not created. I happen to believe that. What are the things that I think? Well, one of the things I've been able to do over the years is to work in issues that involve affordable housing, not just in the classes that I teach, but in real spots where actual houses get built, fixed, and things are happening. A program for affordable housing at a time when redlining was alive and well, facilitating investment in inner city neighborhood housing. That gave me a chance to share the advantages that I have along with the expertise that I have, and to extend that by using the connections that I have. In this case, the church, using the connections that the church had as a lever to get banks to make construction loans for affordable housing in places where they simply weren't willing to make loans before. Using the strengths of the organization to which I belonged, bank officers, access to financial resources, and let things happen in our own neighborhood. A house not in the neighborhood where I drive through every day and where my particular faith-based community is. A house that went from being a pretty crummy little house to being a pretty nice one for a family of 4 people. Okay, Habitat for Humanity. I consider that to be part of my obligation as well. And another one I would talk about is the service to my own religious institution. Probably predictable for someone who's a PK. Although I know a lot of people who were preacher's kids who grew up figuring they went to church so much before they were 17 that they never needed to go, even if they lived to be 2,000 years old. But it's been my privilege to work in this kind of a construction of a facility in an inner city neighborhood where the choice was to leave and to go out, buy a soybean field, plant a church on it, and cover 18 acres with asphalt. And then, of course, lots of people would come and show up. I didn't believe that, so we stayed where we are, and we're working on that with the help of couple of my good friends and colleagues here, Harry Egink and Michelle. Isn't that a neat thing? It's been happening. Another thing that I do is tend my piece of the earth. I'm attached to the earth. Actually, I am attached to a place. I've lived on 2 acres since 1970 and augmented that with another 7 acres over the years, where we are, among other things, participating in reconstructing and rehabilitating a natural wetland, an area that had been farmed for generations, that wanted to be a wetland, that was heavily tiled, but no crops could ever grow there because they always got drowned out anyway. That is a very rewarding kind of thing, and I look forward to puttering around there some more. It goes from being a beautiful lake to being a dry desert because it's a natural ebbing and flowing wetland. Well, change is a constant, and who should know that better than planners? One of the things we learn as we go through life is how to cope with, facilitate, and take advantage of change. It is obvious, and over the years, dramatic in our own lives. Remember that picture of the scared daddy? I got a little bolder with time. But that's the next generation. That's that little kid I was holding up in one hand, holding up her little kid. It's obvious when it happens that way. Being a university professor is the only regular, full-time employment I have ever known. This is my real world, and very real it has been indeed. That real as well. What does such a life prepare you for? I'm going to find out, but I think it's a lot. One thing is sure, I look forward to exciting times with my grandkids. Thank you.